This is NEGOTIATEx Podcast, show number 112. Hello, welcome to the NEGOTIATEx Podcast. My name is Nolan Martin. With me, as always, good friend Aaron Denisian. Aaron, you want to kick it off for today?
Thanks, Nolan. I'll do that. Terry Szuplat is a sought-after speaker and trainer and the author of the national bestseller, Say It Well, Find Your Voice, Speak Your Mind, Inspire Any Audience, in which he shares the public speaking lessons he learned as one of President Barack Obama's longest-serving White House speechwriters. From 2009 to 2017, Terry served as a special assistant to the president and as a member of the National Security Council staff. And from 2013 to 2017, he was the deputy director of the White House Speechwriting Office. Today, Terry runs his own speechwriting firm, Global Voices Communications, and he teaches speechwriting at his alma mater, American University's School of Public Affairs. He lives outside Washington, D.C. with his wife and two children. Terry, welcome to the NEGOTIATEx podcast.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be with you.
So maybe you can answer one of those burning questions. It's one of those for as long as time questions, and here it is. Are great speechwriters born or made?
I think great speechwriters are like great public speakers, great speakers. They're never born. They're always made.
So Terry, if great speechwriters are made, I'm curious about your own journey. Was this a natural calling for you, a natural path, or how did you get into this line of work?
Not at all. I think, very few people, it seems, grow up wanting to be speechwriters. In fact, even now, when I speak to people, a lot of folks don't realize it's something you can actually do with your life as a career path. And I certainly did. I came to Washington, D.C. for college. Like so many people in Washington, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to go argue cases before the Supreme Court. But sort of a funny, not so funny thing happened on the way to law school. I didn't get into law school. So as I was preparing to take the LSAT again, trying to improve my skills around that area, I got a speechwriting job at the Department of Defense for the Secretary of Defense, something I'd always been interested in, rhetoric and government and politics and history. And in the course of that job, just absolutely fell in love with it. Loved the idea of helping a leader kind of find their voice, capture their voice, be the best version of themselves at the podium, and never applied to law school again. So I'm grateful. And it's just led to an incredible career of opportunities that I could never have even dreamed of.
That's great. It's amazing the doors that open when other doors shut. Terry, we're recording this on the day that in 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense. And although it was a pamphlet, it was commonly read out loud to the people of the time. In less than a week from now, we're going to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And obviously, we'll be thinking of his I Have a Dream speech and his letter from a Birmingham prison and so many of his other great, both written and spoken words. If you were to pick one speech, not one that you've written on, but one that inspires you, or you just think is the epitome of kind of what the written and spoken word should be, what would it be? What's your favorite?
Well, you've mentioned some of the greats, and there's so many others. I think one that I always enjoy, that I always go back to, is Robert F. Kennedy's speech in South Africa in 1966, often referred to as sort of the Ripples of Hope speech. And there he is speaking in apartheid South Africa. He's speaking to an audience of young people. And he has this famous line where he talks about how, every act of compassion, every act of courage is like a small ripple that builds over time and can wash away the mightiest walls of oppression. It's just, really just a beautiful, I think, distillation of the power of the individual to make change in the world against seemingly overwhelming odds. And there's a beautiful passage, too, where he goes through history and talks about some of the great leaders in history, Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation, the great leaders, Thomas Jefferson, just 32 years old. He points out so many of them were just young people. We think of them as these gray-haired giants of history, but so many of them were young. And so it's just a beautiful tribute. I think, anyone who's ever sort of down or doubting their ability to make change in the world, it's a great speech to go back to. And it does what all great speeches and presentations do. It's timeless. It's something that speaks to people even today.
You've had the unique opportunity to craft speeches for a U.S. president. What did you learn about the power of words to influence people at the highest levels of government and beyond?
Two big lessons that I took away from that experience, and they're sort of the opposite sides of the same coin, which is, one is that leadership in so many ways does come down to communication. You can be a great technician, a tactician. You can be great at moving the levers of government and institutions and getting these complex bureaucracies to do what you want to do. That's a component of leadership. But so much of leadership ultimately comes back to your ability to articulate some just very basic, profound questions: who you are, why you should be in that job, why people should trust you, what your values are, what your vision is for that organization or for the community you lead or the country you lead. If you can't, we've seen, and I think there are a lot of great examples of this, of leaders who, they're good people, they're decent people, maybe they're good at running an organization, but they're not effective communicators. And I think ultimately those leaders don't succeed. So I think that experience, 8 years of writing for someone who, whether you liked his politics or not, I think everyone agrees is a very effective communicator, taught me that. But then it also taught me about the limits of rhetoric, the limits of words. Ted Sorensen, John F. Kennedy's legendary speechwriter, once wrote that simply saying so doesn't make it so. You can't just go out and give a speech and everybody falls in line. The speech, the rhetoric, the communication, that's the beginning of the process. That's, I think, whether it was in the Barack Obama presidency or other presidencies, you can see the limits of rhetoric as well. And, beautiful words alone don't solve wars, end epidemics, cure social ails. You actually have to go and do the work. Your words have to be matched by deeds. And that's something I talk about in the book as well. Like, it's people ask me, what's your measure of a good speech? And to me, the measure of a good speech is, it's not so much what someone says at the podium. It's actually what the audience does when the speaker's done speaking, whether their words actually have life and legs and go out and actually inspire people to work harder, to donate more, to try harder. And then whether it gives people hope decades later, like I was talking about the RFK speech.
You highlight there that's a critical skill for leaders. How can organizations help develop this skill amongst their leaders or their junior leaders just to improve the organization?
Yeah, well, I think number one, just simply recognizing it as a skill that's important to the success of the organization. Organizations have workforce development budgets, leadership development budgets. They learn all sorts of skills. And one of the reasons that organizations bring me in to advise them is because I think a lot of them don't have this built-in capacity to, make their leaders better communicators. And one of the things that I tell folks when I come into organizations is that, whether you see yourself as a, quote, public speaker or not, everybody is a communicator on behalf of your organization. Because every day you're communicating to your team, to your colleagues, to your peers, to your superiors, to your customers, your clients, your potential customers and potential clients, the basic, who you are, what you do, what makes you different, why they should partner with you. It's not always in front of a group of people. It can be on an email. It can be in a Zoom. It can be on a phone call. We're all communicators, and it's something we all have to invest in.
You just listed a very wide range of potential audience members, internal and external. You've written speeches on many different complex topics for a very wide assortment of international audiences. How do you think about crafting messages to ensure that they resonate appropriately with the listener, whoever they are, wherever they might be, while also ensuring, as you were talking about the RFK speech, that they're more than just a soundbite or white noise, because there's just so much out there these days. And the message is actually, it's memorable, it's lasting.
Well, I think, and I talk about this in the book, I think one of the great communicators spend a lot of time thinking about their audience, deeply about the audience. Who are they? What do they want? What are their values? What are their lived experiences? What are their expectations? What do they need in that moment? Are they hopeful? Are they scared? Are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic? What's driving them? What's going on in their lives? I think, great communicators speak to all of that. In the book, I list out 10 questions that I think everybody should answer before we ever get up to give a presentation, a speech, a pitch of any kind. And a lot of the questions are about exactly that, the audience and what they bring. Now, because again, if you've been doing this for a while, or even if you haven't, most people have a pretty good sense of, I hope, who they are, why they do the work they do, what you and your organization are trying to achieve. You don't have to reinvent that every time you speak, but every time you speak or pitch, you're talking to a different audience. So you shouldn't be given the same exact pitch to everybody all the time, because it's not going to, it might resonate with some people sometime, but if you're not thinking deeply about all those things about your audience. And so that's what we would do when, I traveled with President Obama to more than 40 countries. And now his value core belief system, his agenda, his global vision didn't change every time he stepped foot in a new country. But the way he talked about it would shift and evolve. And because we would spend a lot, you're going to get up and talk to Australians about your vision for international cooperation. Well, that you might have, you should, same guy, same vision, same values, different speech when he went to Africa to speak at the African Union. Because again, you're trying to connect with people in ways that are meaningful in their lives. And I think, great leaders in business and advocacy, politics, that's what they do.
And I think that's a connection to the work that Nolan and I do through influence and negotiation, which is taking the time to think deeply about the concerns of the person we're going to interact with. In this case, it's potentially a large audience.
Mm-hmm.
Quick question here. Did you serve with President Obama when he did his Bin Laden speech in May of 2011?
I was there. I confess, I was not one of the very small group of people who was read into that operation. I learned about it just minutes before everybody else did. I think it was a Sunday night. I was at home with my family, and I don't remember it was still when we had Blackberries or not, but across the phone came final remarks. And that was unusual because usually we would circulate many, many drafts of remarks. So what is this speech that's being circulated? How can it be final when none of us have seen it? And then we saw the headline. So, and then a few minutes later, he went on the air. So yeah, it was a remarkable moment. And then there were a series of speeches that he gave in the days and weeks that followed. He went down to Fort Campbell to thank the personnel who participated in that. He went up to New York to Ground Zero to honor the victims and pay tribute. So there's a whole series of speeches and remarks that he gave around that moment. We felt was important for him to, again, like as effective leaders do, to frame the moment and to, not understand that it was the culmination of many years of work by countless people.
What a powerful speech. So I was a cadet in my first year. I'm graduating that same month. So I'm a senior, less than a month from graduation at the military academy, getting ready to go be an infantry officer. And that speech comes out and it was a riot across all the entire campus. Everyone going crazy. And I just remember it being an extremely emotional and powerful speech. So it's awesome how those can get crafted. And then President Obama, just being such a great orator, delivered it beautifully. Now, is there a difference between writing for someone else who may have a very distinct voice and style, like we said with President Obama, versus writing for yourself? And if so, how do you manage the differences?
Yeah, actually, this is something that a lot of us who wrote for President Obama experienced when we all left the White House. So we had spent years and years, in my case, almost 8 years, with this man's voice in our head every day. That's, as a speechwriter, that's what's going on. You're hearing the person's voice in your head and trying to replicate it as best you can. And then all of a sudden, you're out there giving interviews, giving speeches. And to a person, we all had the same experience. We start to write and we think, we start writing at this defining moment. And I'm like, wait a second, that's not me. That's the other guy. That's Barack Obama. And so you start to think, well, where does that person end and we begin? And I think one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I did have to go through this process rather late in life of finding my own voice. And now it's something that I think we all go through at one point or another. And if people are lucky, they're doing it in their 20s and 30s. Because I had been a speechwriter and kind of suppressed my own voice for so long, for nearly 30 years, just trying to capture other people's. I didn't know what my voice was. I didn't know where my space was, how I could contribute to discussions and conversations and debates. And so it took me a while. And I write about this in the book because I think it's something we all have to go through. I offer a series of questions that I hope everyone can think deeply about, because one of the things that President Obama told me once that I share in the book, I had asked him, what do you think makes a compelling, persuasive speaker? All the years I worked for him, and I'd never asked him that. I never heard him ask it or answer it. And so I wanted to know. And it was interesting because I thought he was going to talk about maybe the structure or, breathing technique or all these sort of tactical things we do. But he had a much bigger answer. And his answer was, he believes that effective public speakers and communicators know who they are, know what they believe, and they speak from a place of core conviction. And that was really, I thought, very profound, because I think we all have sat through presentations and speeches by speakers who clearly don't know who they are or what they believe, because they get up on Monday and say one thing and on Tuesday they say something else. And someone who is sure of their convictions wouldn't do that. And so I think one of the things I offer in the book is that here are some questions you can ask yourself to kind of make sure that you are rooted in core convictions and belief and a value set that doesn't change from event to event, so that you don't feel like you have to reinvent yourself every time you're invited to make a presentation or a speech. It's a process I had to go through, and it's that journey is what I share in the book.
This feels like we're getting into the mechanics of speech writing. We talk about knowing the audience, knowing yourself, knowing your voice. Let's say someone comes up to you and says, I have this speech to give. I'm just not any good at public speaking. I don't even know how to get started. How would you coach someone like that to just start getting prepared?
Well, the first thing I'd say is take a breath, relax. It's okay. What you've described is how most people feel. Most of us don't get up on a regular basis and give presentations and speeches. And the second thing I'd say is, you know what? Don't do that thing where you start watching famous people's speeches and try to replicate it. You've been invited to speak or given this opportunity to speak because somebody who knows you, your colleagues, your sector, your industry, likes you, knows you, thinks that you have something to contribute. So you don't have anything to prove. You don't have to be anybody else. They've invited you because they want you. The best thing you can do is just be yourself. And they say, well, I don't know myself. Okay, that's where we can begin. And I often walk people in the book. I explain how you can do this is, again, ask these basic questions. The most effective communicators, I believe, are the ones who personalize their remarks. They've invited you. They don't want a generic speaker. They've invited you because they want you. They want to hear about your experiences, your life, the stories that you've had in your professional and personal life. Those are the ones that resonate. We've all been in the audience. We know the kinds of speeches that resonate with us. And so I have a whole chapter in the book about all the different ways you can just personalize your remarks. I know I see it in the business community. It's often a reluctance by a lot of business leaders to do this. Like, well, no, I'm here to represent the company. I'm here to talk about the product, the services, the features, the benefits. That's what I'm there to do. And I ask them, well, is that an interesting speech? And the answer is no, that's not very good. Or I talk to speechwriters who work for CEOs. I say, how's that working for them? It's like, it's not working. Because again, we're all human beings and our audiences, we want more than just a product. We want more than just service. We want to know about you. What brought you to this work? Why do you care so deeply about this product or this company? What has it meant to you in your life, in your family, your community? That's what people remember. That's what resonates with people. So I had a client once who, after about 30 minutes of this, put her hand up and said, okay, this feels like a therapy session. And I think, fantastic. That's exactly how you should think about this. Because if you want your audience to know you and believe in you and follow you, then you have to know yourself. That's a big part of the book, is how you kind of pull those stories from your own life.
I've always found that mixing these stories and examples can be helpful. How important is storytelling to becoming a better speaker, or skill or practice involved in becoming a better storyteller?
Oh, it's everything. It's absolutely everything. Great speakers, great presenters, great communicators are in the end great storytellers. Whether it's a story about yourself, your organization, the work you do, the people you're trying to help. You mentioned I teach speechwriting at American University here in Washington, D.C., and we spend a lot of times working on how to effectively tell a story. Whether you open your speech with a story, close a speech with your story, or maybe you make one story the kind of spine of your entire presentation and you start with it and you come back to it throughout. And this is ultimately often the most memorable part of your presentation, right? People remember human stories. This is what resonates with people. This is what they take away. I mean, we had an experience with President Obama. You may remember this. I think it was the 2014 State of the Union. So, 50-minute, 60-minute speech. And in the last few minutes, he devoted his conclusion to a tribute to a wounded warrior from Afghanistan named Corey Remsburg, Army Ranger Corey Remsburg. And he got a 2-minute standing ovation. It was very emotional. The next day, all people were talking about was Corey Remsburg. Who is this man? Let's say he became sort of the face of a generation, almost to the point where people weren't talking enough about the president's policies. So he had talked for, 48 minutes, but it was only that 2-minute tribute, because that just speaks to how powerful these human stories are. Much more. So if we ever had to trim a speech for President Obama, it was too long, I'd trim the policy and keep the stories, keep the real people. That's what resonates with, that's what your audience is going to remember. So it's, it can be your story about why you do this work. It could be the story of an employee or a member of your organization. It can be a story of a customer or client you helped, someone in the community who benefited from your work, really bringing the work that you do alive through storytelling.
We talked about the power of the story just now and how you can basically hold someone's attention throughout by being able to stretch out the story and come back to it, revisit it in a day or at a time when we are all day trading attention. How do we hook them from the start? What's the start to this whole thing? How can we be better at the beginning of a speech?
I actually have structured the book, Say It Well, around how I believe you can structure any great presentation or speech. And sort of it comes down to 3 big parts. I know this is going to sound oversimplistic, but it helps, I think, to think of any presentation as having a distinct beginning, a distinct middle, and a distinct end. And when I teach speechwriting, we actually spend 3 weeks on this. We'll spend a whole week session on the beginning, a whole week on the middle, and a whole week on the end, because I think it's useful. You know, you don't have to be thinking about the entire speech all the time. There are lots of things you can do at the beginning of a speech to pull people in. There are some don'ts that I would highly encourage people to avoid, which is death by acknowledgments. We've all been in these situations where, you know, you're at a graduation ceremony or at a wonderful event of some kind. It's energetic, you know, there's spirit, and the speaker, the master of ceremonies, just gets up and just starts listing a long, horrific list of acknowledgments. And, you know, 2 minutes in, all that energy and spirit's gone. So there are some things we shouldn't do. One of my favorite things to do, though, is to just jump right into a story. Jump right into it, like a great movie does, like a great book does, like a great play does. Just take your audience to the climax, the most emotional moment in your story, and pull them in. You know, the moment you start telling a story, people perk up. You've grabbed their attention. Your audience wants to know how the story ends. And you don't necessarily have to give it to them in the beginning. Again, you can stretch it out and come back to it. I think, again, it goes back to effective storytelling. And again, I think we know this, right? Because we love movies, we love good books, we love good plays. So we're consumers of this. And then we have to give a presentation or something, we forget all of this. Well, think about the last movie that you really enjoyed. You know, it pulled you in seconds, you know, and I think we can do that as speakers too.
In addition to kind of this crafted, prepared start, there's also your physical presence that feels so important to be able to launch well. The communications professor I had when I was in graduate school would talk about a rocket launch, right? That a lot of people slowly warm up into their start versus this powerful, just ground yourself and rocket launch. When you think about being able to deliver that hook well, however you do it, physically, like in terms of physical presence, what's the advice there?
What you're asking about is sort of body language and presence, right? And I'm really torn on this. And I talk about this in the book. And I do offer some suggestions on useful tips when it comes to body language. But the reason I say I'm torn is because I worry that we put too much emphasis on body language because, you know, you go online, you go on LinkedIn, there's all these gurus and they'll tell you, you know, you must do these 18 things to have good body language, you know, to put your feet here and your shoulders here and your hands here. And don't ever do this with your hands. Don't ever do that. And, you know, by the end of it, your head is spinning and you think, wait, I'm supposed to remember all these 18 things when I'm giving a presentation. There's just no way to do it. There are a lot of great speakers out there, including Barack Obama, who, you know, have at times had body language or verbal tics that you would equate with someone who is not an effective speaker. Filler words, too many ums and ahs, and maybe not, you know, too many hand gestures, but yet they're still effective speakers. And so, yeah, I think there are some basic things, you know, stand up straight, you know, smile is one of the most simple things you can do to engage your audience from the very beginning. But, you know, I encourage people not to get too hung up on body language. You know, I tell the story in the book about a college student who was invited to give her commencement address at her university in Florida. And, you know, what an honor, right? Her name is Elizabeth Bonker, and she happens to be nonverbal autism. So she can't do any of the things that you would associate that we're always told you must do, right? She can't maintain eye contact. She didn't smile. She didn't, you know, move her hands and bring her audience in. In fact, she can't even speak. She used text-to-voice software. A computer played her speech. Her body language was non-existent. It was a phenomenal speech. Absolutely phenomenal. It went viral. It went viral around the world. Millions of people were inspired by it because the content, her message was so powerful. She delivered a powerful message about using the voice that God gave you. Phenomenal speech, went viral, touched the hearts of millions of people around the world. So that is a long way of saying, get the message right, get your content right first, do your best with body language, but don't obsess about it. That's my take.
That's great. When I think of President Obama, he always seemed to take big pauses and then place emphasis on different things. Is that a style that you recommend for nervous speakers or anything like that, to just take more pauses and to think about what they say before they say it? Or any advice on that?
Well, that was just his particular style, and some speakers do it, some speakers don't. I mean, there is what we call, you know, the power of the pause. You can sometimes, what you don't say can be as effective as what you do say. You can drop a powerful idea and then pause for a moment, let it sink in with the audience, let them process it for a second. Don't just run over the idea. Pausing gives your audience a chance to applaud if they want. I've seen a lot of speakers deliver just a phenomenal line or make a terrific point, and you can just see the audience they start to put their hands up to clap, and then the speaker keeps going. So they've denied the audience a chance to participate in the experience, which is not good. Because again, speeches are, in the end, experiences between the speaker and the audience. And so there's a lot of reasons to use the pause. I mean, you can use it too often. We've probably all been in situations where you think you want the speaker to pick up the pace a little bit. So yeah, I think it's a person by person thing, but I write about that a little bit, about there are ways you can use the pause to make your point.
What you just said reminded me of maybe a comedian that tells a joke and, he's expecting or she's expecting the audience to go crazy and they don't. So is there times in a speech where you're anticipating an awesome applause and it doesn't come, but you like programmed in a pause there and it's just kind of awkward for a second?
Yeah, it happened. It's funny, whether we were in person at the event with the president or back at our desk at the White House watching it live, we would write it. I would write a speech imagining that, okay, this is a moment where the audience might cheer or applaud. This is a kind of a powerful point. I could see them engaging. And there were some, a lot of times it worked, but then sometimes it didn't. And so it was interesting to watch because I would watch, it's like, okay, the audience, here's the line, it's coming up, nothing. And I could almost see President Obama kind of, okay, all right, okay. And then maybe it would happen again a minute later. I'm like, okay, this audience, for whatever reason, this audience is not feeling it. And I found there were many occasions where clearly he's the one giving the speech. He was seeing the same thing. He then didn't deliver the third line with the emphasis that I had imagined him doing it. And I never had a chance to talk to him about this, but I sometimes wondered, is he sensing what I'm sensing? What this audience is just not there. So there's no sense in nailing that line every single time. You're just not going to get the feedback you want. So, but again, that speaks to what's going on here. These good speeches, good presentations are an experience between the speaker and the audience, and it can build on itself. We've all seen great examples of that. The audience applause, the speaker starts riding the applause. They kind of talk over the applause, which adds another element of drama to it. But the opposite can happen too. And I would sort of put my head down at my desk, like, well, today's not the day.
It reminds me of Michael Scott as he takes the stage before Dwight gets up there to give his Salesman of the Year speech. And he goes to pump up the crowd, says all these jokes, nothing happens, runs off stage, says, tough crowd, good luck.
Yeah, right, exactly. And it becomes a cycle because I've sometimes wondered, I remember sitting there watching the president going, okay, no, don't give up. There's some great stuff coming. Just really nail it. But, if the audience, maybe it was too hot, maybe the audience has been sitting there for hours waiting. You never knew what was, maybe the pre-speech music didn't get him in the mood. You just never know. But sometimes it just doesn't happen. And I talk about that in the book. The president, I should say, a lot of the book is me sharing my conversations with the president from what it was like to learn from him. And one of the things he talks about, he says, some days you're just not there. It's like you're shooting hoops and things are just clanking off the backboard. It's just not happening. And you do your best.
You said that, as a cadet, we had President Obama come to West Point a couple times. And whenever he'd speak, the whole Corps would go to the auditorium, but we'd have to go through security first.
That was nice of you to do, by the way. You had to do that, I think. That was a command performance, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it was cool. I mean, it's still a unique opportunity. Did it with President Bush as well. But we'd get there like 4 hours early. And we're in dress uniform. It's hot. So by the time he gets up there,
no one's having fun.
Yeah, there's occasionally the camera will catch a sleeping cadet and it's like all hell breaks loose. But so I can understand the audience in those rare moments. So
I want to ask about writing jokes, because are all speechwriters expected to be comedians too and be able to write jokes that are going to, kind of land? Because you're talking about speech writing, or giving a speech is this experience between the speaker and the audience, and humor is a great way to connect. I also have a cadet story. I remember sitting and listening to a Vice President Gore deliver some jokes that weren't that funny. So I'm just curious, how hard is it to add the humor piece in?
If all speechwriters had to be comedians, I probably wouldn't be a very good speechwriter. So, you use two different words in there, and I appreciate that. Jokes versus humor, right? So, everyone thinks of the correspondence dinner speeches that presidents give every year where they go and then for about 20 minutes, they sound like a stand-up comedian, right? And those are jokes. It's what we see on late night television every night. It's serious line, joke. We know what the setup, the delivery. Those are jokes. I don't write jokes. I've never known how to do that. But we could get a lot of laughs. I wrote for like I said, I wrote for the president for nearly 8 years in more than 40 countries, and we could get laughs. And we did that by using humor. And one of my colleagues, John Lovett, who took the lead on a lot of the president's correspondence dinners when he was there, and who's a very funny guy. I interviewed him for this book, and he had this, I'm going to butcher it, but he had a beautiful explanation for what humor is. And it was something to the effect of, and it's in the book, humor is when we surprise and delight our audience in a shared connection. And the laughter is that emotional release, right? So you get a laugh when you give a shout out to the local sports team or the favorite food of that city or something they've done or what you had for dinner last night that they love, or just, again, a shared experience. People delight in that, and it often surprises them, and it leads to them laughing. I have to say, I worked on a speech for the president to the Parliament of India, and the government of India wanted the speech to be all about science and technology and the rise of India, and there was a lot of that in there. But we also felt it was important for the president to speak to just ordinary folks, ordinary people in India, including people, just a few miles away in some pretty, rough conditions. I mean, often use the word slum to describe their neighborhoods, no electricity, no running water. And we imagined someone, crowding around a television somewhere watching that. And we thought it would be important if he mentioned some of those neighborhoods where people are just working every day to kind of eke out a living. And he did. I was sitting there in the Indian parliament with him, and I heard laughter. I heard people laughing in the chamber. And it confused me so much. And I thought, why are they laughing? He just took a moment to recognize some of the most sort of vulnerable people on the face of the earth. And I asked some Indians about it later, and they just couldn't believe he mentioned their neighborhood. They were so surprised. They were so delighted. They weren't laughing out of mockery. They were laughing out of just an emotional release. And so, again, that's not humor, but that brings, joy. How can you bring joy to your audience? So that's what I would spend a lot of time on. Sometimes I would think, what can we say in the first 30 seconds or so that might get Barack Obama flashing that big smile, which will get the audience smiling? Or what could he say that might get a chuckle out of him and then get a chuckle out of the audience to kind of have everyone, again, delight in some sort of shared connection. So I think but the great thing about it, you don't have to be a joke writer. People often come to me, I have to give a speech, I need a joke. No, you don't need a joke. You just need to find some sort of connection that'll let you surprise and delight the audience.
Now, maintaining that connection throughout the speech is critical. You mentioned that before. You mentioned the structure about beginning, middle, and end. It feels like in the middle, if that's the place that I'm trying to deliver some meat, all right, make some key points, maybe even get really technical, but that's where the detail is going to be. My kids are involved in speech competitions. I feel like that's always where the audience will start to go to sleep. You had the great hook or something, you got a great wrap up coming or something, but it's in that meat. Does that happen at all levels? And how do you advise speakers to keep the audience engaged during that really more dense or meaty part of what they're trying to say?
The middle is where the West Point cadet falls asleep, right? That's when the head drops. And we have had plenty of examples of that over the years of different leaders speaking to groups like that. If you think of the middle is where you do the business, the work of the speech, the purpose of the speech. Every speech has a different purpose. That's kind of where you're doing it. I think that's where storytelling becomes even more important. You can bring out your policy ideas, your proposals, your initiatives, your 4-point plans, whatever, through stories. It doesn't all have to be just dense policy or dense programmatic. Tell a story about the kind of person you're trying to help. Tell a story of the problem that you're trying to fix. Bring it alive. That's going to make it more memorable. It doesn't have to be a slog. And even, we went through, I thank God I was never the lead speechwriter on a State of the Union address. State of the Union is that speech that every speechwriter says they want to write, and then when they do it once, they never want to do it again. It's sort of a brutal process. I would assist with them. I would help with them. Sometimes I take a first crack at the foreign policy section, but thank God I never had to be responsible for the whole thing. I could be an editor, but yeah, State of the Unions are a great example. I mean, we've all, right, as citizens, we've sat through that. Those things are brutal. No matter how hard the president or the speechwriters try, they're almost always this brutal litany of policies. They bring in the stories of ordinary folks to try to liven it up, some jokes to liven up, but it's hard. I have a whole chapter of the book devoted to the middle. And I think another one of the ways you can do it is, rather than thinking about it as sort of bland policy points, thinking about it as an opportunity to really connect with your audience around shared values. As divided and polarized as we are, research and study shows that there still are basic fundamental core principles that most Americans believe in. The challenge is that everyday politicians and TV pundits aren't talking about that. They're talking about the things that supposedly divide us. So, but you as a speaker you can make a different choice. We can all make a different choice, and we can choose to try to appeal to our audiences around the things that we share.
Yeah, and as you talk about a State of the Union, I also find that the ones that land particularly well with me are I can follow. The transitions make sense. There's a structure to where the president is going. It doesn't feel like we're jumping from here to there, right, on different issues. Almost that storytelling piece, right, that in their mind anyways, there's a story to what they're saying, even if it involves different pieces.
Yeah, and it should. All right. This is, State of the Union's right. That, yeah, we've all sat through them. And a president will say, now let me talk about the economy. Like, wait a second. I thought we were just talking about something. Now this sounds just like a list. This is not fun and interesting to listen to. Yeah, to always try to find some sort of core animating theme that does connect things, disparate topics. We tried very hard to do that. I wish more presidents would try to do that. I think we owe the American people coherence, a compelling vision. It's not just, there is a connection between the economy and the environment. There is a connection between immigration and inflation and what have you, and housing. These things relate to one another. So like a good book, like a good movie. We've all seen bad cuts in movies. There are bad cuts in speeches too. So yeah, I think having a coherent story. And one of the things that President Obama would tell us when we would, for a particularly big speech, we'd get to go up to the Oval Office and sit with him and listen and kind of get his thoughts. And one of the things he would often say to us was, before we ever get into all the details and the mechanics, was, what's the story we're trying to tell here? Which was his way of saying, just what's the big message you want the audience to remember before you go off and try to tell them 10 different things. And so in the book, I recommend this is something we can all do, to set aside time before we start trying to write a presentation or create a 100-slide deck, PowerPoint. What is it I want my audience to remember? What's the one thing I want them to take away? You get that right, and it makes the whole process much easier.
All right. Well, and that ties to the last part of your structure. How do you start? What's the middle? Now the end. So you have a chapter in the book called The Only Way to End a Speech. Nolan and I are dying to know what's the only way to end a speech. What do the great communicators, how do they conclude, and how do they leave that audience?
I think great communicators, great presenters, great speakers, great leaders always end their speech with hope. There is no point in getting up and standing up in front of a group of people in person or on television, taking their time, asking them to listen to what you have to say, unless you're going to leave them with a sense of hope and optimism that the thing you're trying to do is possible, that the war can be ended, the disease can be cured, the economy can be improved, the fires can be put out, whatever it is you're speaking about, that this company can do better next quarter, we can beat the competition, we can raise more money, unless you actually believe and give your audience a sense that they can actually do it. Because that's the purpose, right? You're taking people's time because you want them to do something. Think differently, act differently, work harder. You have to leave your audience with a sense of hope. There's a lot of science behind hope and what optimism really is. There's a neuroscientist out of the UK who spent years studying how we all think about the future, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'll paraphrase it, that we tend to overestimate the likelihood of good things happening in our lives and underestimate the likelihood of bad things happening. They call it the optimism bias. And they feel that in their research, they find that about 80% of people across cultures and countries and backgrounds and demographics have this bias. Most people believe that if you work hard, you can make things better. I think as speakers, as a presenter, this gives us a superpower. Because if most of the people in your audience believe that tomorrow can be better, believe that the problem can be solved, then it's your job as a speaker to really tap into that and just release that and unleash that optimism. And then, again, we see great leaders throughout history, politics, business, advocacy. When you give people a sense of hope, it's remarkable what they will do. Soldiers will sacrifice. People will work long hours. Give them hope that they can actually achieve something, a goal to work towards that's achievable, and your audience will rise to the occasion. So that, to me, great speakers always end with hope.
Terry, as you reflect on a lifetime of work and at the highest level, is there one speech that you've crafted that you're most proud of that not only landed with the audience, but truly changed something or had the desired impact?
Yeah, so I grew up in Massachusetts. And so after the Boston Marathon bombing, and we heard that the president was going to go up and speak at the memorial, I asked if I could take the lead on our speechwriting team and working with the president on it, because I knew how important it would be to my family and friends back home. And so, one of the things I've always tried to do when I work on a speech is imagine one person that I'm writing the speech, and I encourage people to do this. You have to give a speech, a eulogy, a tribute, a toast, or a presentation at work. Oh my God, I have to speak to 50 people, 500 people, 5,000 people. How do I connect with that many people? It's almost impossible to imagine. Just pick one person someone maybe even and write the speech, prepare the presentation for them. If you can connect with them, you probably connect with most of the people in the audience. So all that week, working on the Boston Marathon draft, I was thinking of my family and friends back home, including my Uncle Dan, who's sort of lifelong Bostonian, Boston through and through. Everything you love and loathe about Boston, he was that. And he was also a staunch conservative who didn't care for Obama, didn't particularly care the fact that I was working for him. And so Thanksgiving dinners were always a joy. But I thought for, a lot of that week, I was thinking, what maybe in this one moment, what could Barack Obama say that might resonate with someone like my Uncle Dan? And I kind of imagined him watching it in a pub with his buddies. And so much of that speech with the president's edits, by the way, he really went multiple rounds and just really took the speech to a whole different level, both in terms of his edits and his delivery at the pulpit. And one of our staffers, also from Massachusetts, said, that speech was a love letter to Boston. And it really was. Later that day, I noticed I had a voicemail on my phone and I listened. It was my Uncle Dan. And I could tell from the background noise that he was in a pub with his buddies in Boston. And in his thick Boston accent, he said something to the effect of, we all just watched the speech. The president did a very fine job. And he hung up. It was about as much as he was ever going to say about Barack Obama. But that experience, the reason I say all this, because it really reminded me that, as divided and as polarized as we are, there are still things and spaces and places where we can come together as Americans. There are things that we share that if we can lean into them, if we can speak to those things, not everything has to be political. If we can move the conversation into these areas where there are still things we share, then you can actually have a connection, an unlikely connection, even with the most skeptical of audiences. And so to be able to have played a part in a speech like that meant a lot to me. One of the things I always tell people is, so you can do it too. When you're giving a presentation, again, maybe don't focus on the fact you have to speak to 1,000 people or 100 people or 10 people. Just find that one person, find your Uncle Dan, prepare the presentation for them, and they will, I guarantee you, if you can connect with that one person, you can connect with the whole room.
Boy, I just love that story. When I think about the work that, again, that we're trying to accomplish through this podcast and that others in this field are accomplishing, trying to work, it's finding those places and the ability to have those conversations. And I love how you both thought through it and then created an environment in which words could land and be heard perhaps differently than they would have been without the same kind of care and attention. Terry, as we get ready to wrap up, kind of a final thought or question. Most of our listeners are never going to give a speech on a global stage or have to write one that will be delivered on a global stage, but they still need to influence in their daily lives. And as you were just referring to, these skills have great application to us drawing closer together as individuals and as a society. So what final word or thought would you give in terms of encouragement for someone who says, I want to take some ownership over my ability, both written and spoken word, to get better? What would you tell them?
I'd say you've got this. You actually have everything you need to excel and to succeed at this already. You may, even if you haven't done it. Again, the audience is looking for something authentic, something unique from you. Say what only you can say. That's one of the chapters in the book. You don't have to be anybody else. You don't have to sound like Barack Obama or Ronald Reagan or whoever it is you admire. That's not who they want. They want you. And so however you speak, however you carry yourself, that's what they want. That's what they're looking for. Be willing to share stories and experiences from your own life. Be vulnerable. And don't be afraid to kind of be vulnerable and share the parts of yourself and the parts of your work that maybe you don't always feel comfortable talking about. It will make for a remarkable presentation.
I really appreciate that. Authenticity and vulnerability, two great ingredients to connecting more effectively. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you so much.
This has been great. Really appreciate you taking the time. I know you have a busy schedule. Thanks so much for the book that you've written. I've already told my older kids it's going to be on their reading list this spring as they get ready for speech competition.
Oh, great.
Thanks a lot, though, for being with us.
I appreciate it.
That is it for us on today's podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx podcast if you haven't already. And we'll see you in the next episode.